it doesn't matter what's in his head. This is like this old chestnut that media newsrooms did during the first Trump term. Well, we can't call him a racist. We don't know what's in his heart. I don't give a shit what's in people's hearts or heads. I give a shit what they say and do. That's what I'm going to judge you on. And what he says and does is deeply bigoted, dangerous, conspiratorial, delusional, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and more.
Swindon-born journalist Mehdi Hasan left Britain for the United States in 2015 and went on to become one of its most prominent left-wing commentators and a host of a primetime show on the US national broadcaster MSNBC. Then, not long after the start of the Israel-Hamas war and Mehdi's outspoken criticism of Israel, his show was cancelled. He's now going it alone as the CEO of the new media company Zeteo. And he joins me now. A ceasefire deal looks within reach in the Middle East. Israel hasn't got all the hostages back. Of about 250 people taken captive on October the 7th, there are 100 hostages still remaining in Gaza, and at least a third of them are suspected to be dead. Meanwhile, about 46,000 people have been killed in Gaza since then, according to the territory's health ministry. It's been a military victory for Israel at a terrible cost. Mehdi, what do you think Hamas wanted to happen if we go back to that 1st October?
It's a good question. I don't know. Hamas are not the most transparent of groups. Like a lot of these groups, they're pretty opaque. Obviously, they've become even more opaque since October the 7th, as a lot of their people in Gaza went underground. There was a time when they did interviews. I interviewed a spokesman for Hamas about a decade ago when I had a weekly show on Al Jazeera English, Osama Hamdan. So it's very hard to kind of pry it together. People have their own theories. Some would argue it was an attempt to free prisoners on the Israeli side, who the Palestinians would say hostages on the Israeli side. Others would say it was an attempt to stop the Abraham Accords from extending to Saudi Arabia and Israel and Saudi doing a deal. And others would simply point out it was people in a besieged strip of land under occupation, under siege in particular, for around 20 years, breaking out from what I think David Cameron once called an open-air prison camp. So multiplicity of reasons for the original horrific attack and the taking of hostages, which is, of course, a war crime. And it's a tragedy that those hostages haven't been able to come home. Some of the hostages who were released have said that their Hamas captors said to them, don't worry, you'll be free in a few days, which suggests that a lot of these Hamas guys thought this was we go in, take hostages, we do a deal, we get some of our people back, which is what Israel has done over previous decades, right? And obviously, this time around, Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and co had very different plans, to the point where, and you mentioned kind of we're maybe close to a ceasefire deal, seen this movie before many times, to the point where Hamas have agreed to all sorts of conditions, and Israeli politicians have urged Netanyahu to sign a deal. Israeli families of hostages have protested outside Netanyahu's house, and he has refused to do a deal. And I feel like if they do a deal before January the 20th, before Trump comes in, great news. But I feel like a lot of people died, obviously, mostly on the Palestinian side, but also Israeli troops. A few died the other day. It'll be almost like a Vietnam situation where you carried on the war beyond any reasonable point and people died for no reason. We could have done this deal last summer. We could have done this deal last April. According to one hostage family member, forum spokesman, there was a deal on the table in October of 2023.
Sure. I mean, those attacks, the October the 7th attacks, they weren't just about taking hostages. There was torture, there was rape, there was mass murder. Hamas must have expected and perhaps even desired a response for that. Any nation would respond to that. Any nation would not only respond to that, any nation would probably deem it intolerable that this kind of threat existed next door. Do you think that there could be a nihilistic streak in Hamas that wanted an overwhelming response under the calculation that overwhelming responses work in their favor at the expense of the Palestinian people?
So a couple of things. Number one, yes. Clearly, it's been the strategy of insurgent groups, militant groups, terrorist groups, whatever phrase you want to use, over the years to provoke responses. Some of us, Hugo, who go back to 9/11, you and I are old enough to remember 9/11. We were working journalists on 9/11. Said at the time, like
when did we become the older ones, Mehdi?
I know
when did that
happen?
Grey.
It's the grey. I was one of those people for many years after 9/11 and after the 7/7 bombings, obviously the Iraq War, saying this is what bin Laden wants. He wants to provoke. Now it's kind of conventional wisdom. Oh, Iraq was a disaster. Afghanistan, we shouldn't have stayed so long. But at the time, people thought this is the way to fight terrorism. And some of us were saying, no, it is to bait a response. It's to radicalize people around the world further. It's to have images like the images we saw from Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. And the same applies, I think, in the Israel-Gaza situation. Of course, Hamas benefits from Israel bombing the crap out of the Gaza Strip. Every time Elon Musk, I was looking back at some old quotes, now he's super pro-Israel and Netanyahu's guest at Congress. Elon Musk, of all people, I came across a clip recently, went on Lex Friedman's show in November of 2023 and said precisely what a lot of us have been saying for a while, which is every time you kill an innocent Gazan, their kid probably wants to join Hamas to get revenge, right? This is just common sense. This is resistance movements, as I say, insurgency movements around the world for years. So I think that's always been part of it. That's obvious. It's not just October 7th. That's 50 odd years of occupation or more, where you're creating more terrorists than you're killing, quote unquote, to borrow a line from the late Donald Rumsfeld. But that's only one part of it. I would question some of the premises of your question when you made the point about any nation would have responded. Yes, 100%. But when you say any nation would have responded to a threat next door, it almost normalizes what Israel is doing. And what Israel has done is not normal, right? Israel is the only country in the world to be carrying out a military occupation of this length, this duration, this intensity. Gaza is not next door under international law. Gaza is occupied territory by the Israelis, as is the West Bank, where they are killing innocents as we speak, just in recent days. So we have to kind of reframe the way we talk about this stuff. This is not two neighboring countries. People often say, what would you do if Mexico fired rockets into America? America doesn't occupy Mexico.
Whatever one does with the language, there was a border, whether it was an internal or an external border, there was a threat across the border, which had shown in terms of the strategy that Israel had been following for a long time, was uncontainable. People crossed the border, huge numbers of people died, massive national trauma within Israel. To this day, the vast majority of Israelis support the conflict. Not all of them, but the vast majority do. Well,
there's a separate debate we could have about what's happened to Israeli society in recent years and the right-wing drift of Israeli society for good reasons and bad. But again, I would just question this idea of border next door. Israel is the.
I'm not sure it particularly matters. I mean, obviously it matters in international law, but whether it matters in terms of how a country is going to react to that kind of threat. I mean,
it does in terms of legal, political, moral justifications, right? Because your point was any country, and I'm saying, but I often hear American supporters of Israel say, if Mexico was firing rockets into, we would not tolerate this. But Mexico's not been occupied by America.
Okay,
you have to look at
if New Jersey was firing rockets into New York, they wouldn't tolerate it.
Sorry?
If New Jersey was firing rockets into New York, if you prefer.
Agreed, but New Jersey's not occupied by New York for 50 years, reduced to all sorts of starvation-level conditions, killed. Well, I mean, this is my point. Gaza Strip is not a neighboring country. Gaza is under occupation. People were living in, as I say, David Cameron's words, an open-air prison camp. At some point, you knew. I mean, this is not me saying this. People like Shlomo Brom, former Israeli general, saying, how long did you think we could hold these people basically hostage, and they wouldn't do anything?
Except Israel did effectively pull out of Gaza quite a long time ago. I guess
they ended the occupation and they started a brutal siege.
They were nonetheless not present on the ground in Gaza.
Irrelevant to the lives of Gazans who couldn't come and go as they will, whose airspace was controlled, sea waters was controlled, 3 or 4 land entries was controlled, population register was controlled.
But Gaza itself was controlled by Hamas, and the huge amount of money that went into Gaza was weaponized, was used to construct tunnels, was used to construct military installations, was spent on rockets and so on. The reason why I frame it in these terms is because personally, I am and have always been in favor of a two-state solution in the Middle East. I don't know if you are. You can tell me that in a minute. Critics of that from the right, and indeed Israeli critics, whether on the right and the left, they say the problem with the idea of a two-state solution is a Palestinian state we have seen will end up looking like Gaza. How would you respond to that?
I mean, I don't know.
Why wouldn't it end up looking like Gaza?
It might end up looking like Gaza if Israel treats the Palestinian state, independent state, in the way it's treated Gaza. I mean, Gaza is Gaza because of Israel, not because of Hamas. Hamas exists because of Israel. Hamas was formed in the late 1980s.
But the West Bank isn't Gaza.
Exactly.
The
That's a great point
West
you
Bank
make.
isn't a dream, but it's also not ruled by Hamas, and it's not Gaza.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. The West Bank is not Gaza, and yet Israel has killed a record number of people in the West Bank over the last year. It's killed a record number of children in the West Bank over the last year. Sky News, at the morning we're speaking, has a video out showing a grandmother being killed by Israelis entering a West Bank refugee camp in an ambulance, something we were told was a huge war crime when Hamas does it. So I'm glad you mentioned the West Bank. That is exactly my point. It doesn't matter whether Hamas is in control of a place or not. Israel does not want to give Palestinians self-determination or not. Israel will continue killing Palestinians, whether they are Hamas or not, whether they're ruled by Fatah or not. This, as I say, Hamas came along in the 1980s. I know we want to make everything about Hamas, but Hamas came around in the 1980s. Israel was created in 1948. The occupation began in 1967. So let's just be clear about what is the driving cause of all this, which is occupation.
Israel occupies and has killed Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza. You know, and I know the situation in both are very different. I've been to the
I'm
West
agreeing
Bank
with you.
several
I'm agreeing
times.
with you in saying
I wouldn't have dreamt of going to Gaza. And
Hugo, I'm agreeing with you. They are very different. So why is Israel killing people in both places?
If Israel had pulled out of the West Bank when it pulled out of Gaza and Hamas had taken control of the West Bank might look a lot like Gaza. In what sense, my question is to you, in what sense is a future Palestinian state different from Israel pulling out of Gaza?
Well, because, first of all, let's get our terms right. Israel did not pull out of Gaza. Israel continued the occupation of Gaza. Israel strangled Gaza. Israel measured the number of calories allowed to go into Gaza.
It didn't control Gaza enough to prevent the construction of tunnels, of military infrastructure.
It was not physically present
of an astonishing number of rockets. They still have enough that they're still firing them.
I agree it was not physically present on the ground inside the prison. It simply monitored the walls of the prison, but it still created prison-like conditions. If it does that for a Palestinian state, yeah, it probably won't be any different. And I think people like my good friend Peter Beinart and others have made this point. There have been times throughout the process where Hamas has not been popular with Palestinians. And those are the times when peace was on the horizon, right? You could track opinion poll surveys, which shows Palestinians are less interested in armed resistance, less interested in supporting Hamas when there is a prospect of peace and justice and freedom on the table. When it's not, like people around the world, whether you're in Ukraine, Gaza, Kashmir, wherever else, people turn to armed resistance and violence when they see no other solution.
No, understood. Look, you called a few months ago in a column for Israel to be expelled or suspended from the UN. Have you ever called for anyone else to be expelled or suspended from the UN?
No.
Why break the habit of a lifetime? Why is this your first one? Why? Should be taking this your belief that no nation on earth has, since the foundation of the UN, has behaved worse than Israel, or has deserved it in the same way that Israel does? No.
Did you read the piece, Hugo?
Of course I read the piece.
So obviously I didn't suggest that Israel has behaved worse than any other country in history. No, I would say, for example, North Korea today has a much worse form of government and life for its people than Israel, obviously. That wasn't the point of the piece. The point of the piece is that no country in my lifetime has killed as many UN employees, UN workers, has thumbed its nose at the UN, to the point where the outgoing ambassador, maybe your listeners may be not aware of this, the outgoing UN ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, called for the wiping out of the Israeli Security Council. Can you imagine if the Iranian ambassador or the Russian ambassador had such things? No, they've killed a massive number of UN personnel. They haven't given a damn about those UN personnel. They've ignored UN officials at every stage. They've threatened UN officials. As I say, they've made jokes, or if you want to call it a joke, about flattening the UN Security Council building. Just last week, Hugo, you mentioned rape earlier. The UN Special Envoy on Women and Protection of Women asked for access to Israel to investigate both Israeli accusations of sexual violence against Hamas and Palestinian accusations of sexual violence by Israeli soldiers, and Israel refused to let her in and refused to even engage. So it was a specific column about Israel's relationship with the UN. Why should the UN tolerate a UN member that has no interest in the UN itself, thumbs its nose at the UN, was created, by the way, created by the UN, let's not forget. That was the specific argument. It wasn't, of course, saying that Israel is worse than any other country. I know that a lot of defenders of Israel, I'm not saying this is you, but a lot will do this whole whataboutism. That wasn't what I was engaged in. By the way, if you were to come to me and say, let's make a case for getting North Korea from the UN, yeah, I'd sign on to that.
The question of the number of people who work for the UN who've been killed in Gaza, that is true. And this is a trick question, but can you tell me the largest employer in Gaza before the conflict?
UNRWA.
Exactly, part of the UN. The vast majority of the people we're talking about were not killed in their capacity. Don't get me wrong. I mean, these are people being killed in a war zone. I'm even in the case of war, I'm rarely going to say that's okay. But these are not people who were killed because they were UN workers. You know that as well, right? These are people who were killed. These were Palestinians. These were often
some of them I'm sure were killed because they're UN workers. Some of them surely were targeted.
Israel some of them were killed because they were Hamas fighters.
The entire UN agency is a terrorist outfit based on intelligence that most Western governments, with the exception of my own, the US, has rejected.
That's
hyperbole.
It's
not just UNRWA, Hugo. It's the World Food Programme. I don't know if you've read some of the comments from Cindy McCain, who is the head of the World Food Programme, about deliberate attacks on World Food Programme trucks. Have you seen when the polio vaccines were going on? I'm sure you saw the image of the World Food Programme truck with bullets to the door and window. This was not crossfire. This was targeted attack on a driver of a World Food Programme. By the way, when you've lost Cindy McCain, the widow of the most pro-Israeli senator of my lifetime, John McCain, I think that tells you everything about Israel's strategy in Gaza.
What do you think is going to happen under a Donald Trump presidency in the Middle East?
It's hard to predict what's going to happen under Donald Trump because his presidency is marked by chaos, as we know. Look, just on paper, when you look at it, when you look at the people he's appointed, when you look at his own record, and when you look at his own rhetoric, I think this is a great victory for Benjamin Netanyahu. And Hugo, I say that as someone who is part of the Muslim American community, who spent a lot of time with Muslim Americans last year, election year, hearing from them saying, we can't vote for Harris or Biden because they've been complicit in a genocide. And I would say to them, but Trump's going to be worse. And they would say, no, he's not. No one can be worse than what we've seen. And B, Trump won't be as pro-Israel as Biden or Harris. Well, but Trump comes in and look at the people he's appointed to his cabinet. His ambassador to Israel is Mike Huckabee, a man who says there's no such thing as the West Bank. There's no such thing as a Palestinian. He's appointing Pete Hegseth as defense secretary, who says you can't be an American unless you love Israel. He's appointed Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, long-standing neoconservative, hardcore supporter of Netanyahu and Israel. We go down the list. It's a very, very pro-Israel team. He obviously has a Christian evangelical base that have dreams of Jesus returning when Israel conquers the Middle East and destroys Iran. And by the way, all the Jews will die in the process, which is not the best of deals, I would argue, for Israeli Jews. He himself, Trump, is a belligerent. He's not a fan of Muslims in general. He has a few Arab friends, especially in the Gulf. But look, I think it's going to be much worse for the Palestinians. He's got Miriam Adelson, Hugo, his biggest donor, who gave $100 million with the condition that money only goes to you if you promise to annex the West Bank or allow Netanyahu to annex the West Bank. And we know on Trump's first term, Hugo, the Golan Heights was annexed by Israel with American approval. In fact, many people don't know this, but Donald Trump is the only president in American history with an illegal settlement named after him in the Golan Heights. So I think it's only going to get worse.
I did not know that. You mentioned Iran. Before we come back to Donald Trump,
yeah.
Where are you on Iran? What's your position on Iran? Would you like to see a revolution there?
What a question. That's a new one. Where are you on Iran?
Where are you on Iran?
No.
Good thing, bad thing.
Yeah. Where am I on Iran? I would like to see democratic change in Iran. Yeah, I would like to see a proper democracy. I'd like to see a democracy in every country in the Middle East. I'm pro-democracy. I'm a Democrat, small d, not big D. But I'm in favor of democracy. I'm in favor of freedom. I'm in favor of people being able to choose their government and throw out their government. I'm in favor of people having basic freedoms in line with the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, of course, all of us want to see change in Iran. What I worry is that that becomes harder to bring in when you threaten military action against a country. I don't think we've seen Western strategy improve the lives of Iranians. In fact, some of the sanctions on Iran have made life much harder for Iranians and the Iranian middle class, which is where you would see, in most countries, demand for democratic change. So I think our strategy has been awful. I think one thing you asked about Trump, I think Benjamin Netanyahu now will think to himself, the dream of a lifetime for many on the Israeli right to attack Iran is closer than ever before, because you have an administration full of Iran hawks like Rubio, like Hegseth, and like Huckabee. So I think Netanyahu is going to have designs there, and Trump may or may not go along with it. We never know which Donald Trump you're going to get. Are you going to get the isolationist Trump who doesn't want war in the Middle East or Asian trade? Are you going to get the Trump who says, yeah, we'll bomb the shit out of stuff? So I think, with the Houthis on the defensive, with Hezbollah in a very weakened position, with Assad gone, I'm sure many in Israel and on the American right think this is the best time to attack Iran. I think that would be a disaster. I think a war with Iran would make Iraq war look like a walk in the park. I don't think military action, I think the neoconservative dream of bringing democracy by the barrel of a gun, is nonsense. I think revolutions in general tend to go in directions that people don't really accept. Remember, the original Iranian Revolution didn't go according to plan.
Do you think the current Iranian regime is a destabilizing force in the Middle East, or do you think that they are victims of other stabilizing forces? I know what I think, and it's the first of those. I want to know if you do as well.
I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I think all
Really?
of these governments. You don't think Iran is a victim of destabilizing? You don't think people have been trying to destabilize Iran for decades? You don't think there have been CIA and Mossad attempts? You don't think Israel bombing Iran earlier this year, or last year? Sorry, we're in 2025. You don't think that's destabilizing?
Iran is the sponsor. Is a major sponsor of Hamas. Was the sponsor of Hezbollah. Was the sponsor of Assad. Is the sponsor of the Houthis
I'm not
Yemen.
denying any of that, but then I think, Hugo, when it comes to Iran and understanding Iran's role in the region, you can't just start at a random date of your choice that is self-serving. This is my problem with our approach to Iran. Especially, I'm in the US, Hugo, where everyone has the memory of a goldfish. There's no appreciation of history. Whereas as you know, in the Middle East, everyone has very long memories. Yeah. So if you talk to an American, maybe they'll go back to the hostage crisis. They probably just go back to Hamas, Hezbollah, as you just mentioned. Whereas the Iranians will go back to 1953. They'll say, you know what? This all started when you interfered in our country and you toppled an elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. You brought back the Shah of Iran, one of the most brutal leaders of the 20th century. That then leads to the 1979 revolution of Khomeini. And then when Khomeini comes to power, yes, you have the hostages crisis, but you also have the Iran-Iraq war, where America and Rumsfeld and Reagan encouraged Saddam to carry out a brutal invasion and war and the killing of tens of thousands of Iranians, etc., etc. America shoots down the Iranian airliner. We go through the history. My point is, we have to understand that both sides have a lot of grievances.
But they have autonomy here and now. I mean, Iran has autonomy here and now.
Agreed.
And Iran has been choosing to sponsor Hamas, choosing to sponsor Hezbollah. Choosing to sponsor the Houthis as they've fired.
And they would say, look, I don't speak for Iran. I've told you already, I don't like the government. I would change the government if I could be more democratic. But they would say, in the geopolitical arena we're in, that they sponsor Hamas and Hezbollah because of Israeli aggression. And they would have a certain point. Certainly the people of Lebanon have seen that over the last few months, what Israel's done to their country and how many people they've killed and displaced.
The people of Lebanon seem, as far as I can tell, to be sort of quite glad to see the back of Hezbollah and hoping they don't return.
I think some do and some don't. I think mostly right now they're pretty upset that Israel just destroyed a big swath of their country again, killed thousands of people, including many children again, displaced 1 million people. I think that's a bigger concern to most Lebanese people I know.
Do you what do you think about the prospects
but just one final point on Iran.
Yeah, sure.
In 2015, Obama did the Iran nuclear deal. That was a moment where you talk about autonomy. Iran did come to the table. America did come to the table. The EU did come to the table. There was a moment there for some kind of rapprochement, some kind of, Iran wasn't going to become a democracy overnight. America wasn't going to stop, worrying about Iran. But to use your phrase, there was going to be less destabilizing behavior in the region. And a lot of analysts at the time thought this was a moment. And I think, elections have consequences. Donald Trump comes in and tears up the Iran nuclear deal. Joe Biden comes back a few years later. It doesn't really put any political capital or will into bringing back the nuclear deal, even though he'd promised to do so. And here we are a decade later, and things are much worse in the Middle East, as you say.
Do you think, would you say Trump is solely to blame for the Iranian nuclear deal not working out? I would have thought.
150%. 150%.
Oh, really? You wouldn't place any blame on the Iranian government for that as well?
No, the whole point of the nuclear deal was you had a prospect to see what happens, right? The Iranian government may have violated it, but they hadn't violated when he tore it up. The IAEA said that everyone was sticking to the deal. And what's interesting is when Republicans go on about, the deal, it allowed them. Iran is, quote unquote, closer to a nuclear bomb today than it was in 2015. So whose fault is that? That has to be.
What do you think? What do you think about that? The prospect about Iran having a nuclear bomb. Does it horrify you?
I don't think any countries in the Middle East should have nuclear weapons, and I think it's a problem that Israel is the only country that has nuclear weapons in the Middle East because it incites other countries to want to have nukes too, including Saudi Arabia, which I don't think should have nuclear weapons.
Even while thinking no country should have. Even while thinking no country should have nuclear weapons.
Resolution 687, Hugo, calls for a region free of nuclear weapons. I support that. There's only one country in the Middle East right now that has nuclear weapons, refuses to declare it, and refuses to open its facilities to IAEA inspectors. That is the state of Israel.
I may think that I'd rather none of my actual human friends had nuclear weapons, but I could also make a list of the ones I'd least like to have nuclear weapons.
Fair enough.
Where would you put Iran on that list?
Where's the list? Entire Middle East?
Well, sure, but I mean, where would you put Iran on that? Where would you put Iran on that list relative to Israel?
Somewhere to would you rather Iran? I don't think either country. Well, here's what's interesting.
Yeah.
Again, to come back to this idea of autonomy, you say Iran has autonomy. Okay, but why does Israel want nuclear weapons, right? Sorry, why does Iran want nuclear weapons? If it indeed does want nuclear weapons, the US Intelligence Committee has a big debate about whether it has nuclear weapons, whether it wants nuclear weapons, whether it's trying to get nuclear weapons. The point is, if you're a country surrounded, right, by countries you think are hostile, would you not want to get nuclear weapons? You look at what happened with Ukraine. We're all talking about Ukraine in the last couple of years. Ukraine famously gave up its nukes for guaranteed security. There are some in the West who say they never should have done that now in hindsight, given what Russia has done. You look at what happened. If you're Iranian and you look at Gaddafi and you see what happens to Libya and you look at Saddam, just saying this from a pure realpolitik perspective, would you not want to try and get nuclear weapons to protect your regime? That's my whole point. If you want to try and change Iranian behavior, we also have to change our own behavior. That's why the nuclear deal in 2015 was so important, because it lowered the tensions.
By the same token, if you're Israeli, you'd probably think if Iran did have a nuclear weapon, Iran would say, don't go into Gaza or we will fire our nuclear weapon at you. I mean, that seems a plausible fear.
I do think it's plausible, which is why I would like to see, as you would, peace in the Middle East so that all these countries don't think they need nuclear blackmail.
Well, we can agree on peace. Let's turn back to America. I want to ask you about the election. I'm sure you know there's been an election. Kamala Harris. What went wrong there? Was she a weak candidate? And would she have been a weaker candidate if she agreed with you more?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
There has been this debate on the left and centre left in recent months about the Harris candidacy and presidential approach. I'm waiting a bit. I've tried not to do too many strident, sweeping views on this subject, because I feel like whenever an election is lost, especially on the left, everyone just uses their priors to justify it, right? It's, if she had been more like me, as if you're Matt Iglesias, for example, who's a more centrist pundit in the US, if she'd listened more to me, she'd have won. And people on the left say, if you'd listened more to the Bernie wing, she'd have won. I think that's a little lazy intellectually, just to simply go, oh, I wish you'd listen more to me. That's point number one. Point number two, elections are super close in the US right now, Hugo. If 133,000 votes had gone a different way in the three key Rust Belt states, she would be president-elect, about to be sworn in as president of the United States. We would not be having a debate about whether she was a weak candidate or not. And she was a weak candidate, but we'd just be accepting the fact that she defeated Trump. Trump's gone. Republicans are in disarray. First black woman president, amazing time. So again, things could have gone a very different way.
Okay.
Number three, I would say she was a weak candidate, but she was the only candidate on offer. It was a fantasy to suggest there could be any kind of open primary at the point where Joe Biden stood down, right? The villain in all of this is Joe Biden for not stamping down a year earlier, and his team for not recognizing, or at least telling the rest of the world, that he clearly is as enfeebled and incompetent as a lot of his right-wing critics were suggesting. And I think that made it a problem that Harris was the only option. I came out in The Guardian in July and wrote a piece saying Biden needs to step aside, Harris needs to take over. She's the only hope the Democrats have of winning. I stand by that. I think that analysis was correct. They did have a chance of winning with her. They didn't have a chance of winning with Biden.
Well, you've written about this a little bit, but why do you think so many Muslims voted for Donald Trump?
So just contextually, of course, the majority of Muslims voted for Kamala Harris. Sure. But yes, a bigger percentage of Muslim Americans, Arab Americans voted for Trump this time than they did in 2020.
Particularly in Michigan.
Or 2016, particularly in Michigan, in a place called Dearborn, Michigan, which is called the Arab American capital of the US. There's a high concentration of Arab and Muslim Americans and Arab American Christians, by the way. And a lot of those people were justifiably upset over the Biden-Harris's complicity in Israel's genocidal attack on Gaza and on Lebanon, by the way, big Lebanese American community in Michigan. And look, I spoke to a lot of these people. I did a lot of events with these people, and I understand. I was never going to go say, you must vote for Harris as the lesser of two evils. That doesn't work, Hugo, when you're talking to someone who's lost 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, in some cases, 100 members of their extended family back in Gaza or Lebanon. So for a lot of people, this was very personal. It was heartbreaking for a lot of people. These are people who've been Democrats their entire lives and said, look, this time we can't do it. I can't vote for someone in the middle of a genocide who's not just carrying on sending weapons to the Israeli government, but won't even bring themselves to even issue the most mildest of public criticism of what Netanyahu is doing. Won't even sit down with us. You know what Trump did, Hugo? Why Trump is such a political genius sometimes, despite being also adult, is he went to Dearborn. Right? He went to an Arab American city. You'd think Donald Trump would want to run away. And he said, I'm the peace candidate. I'm the anti-war candidate. Don't vote for her. She's got Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, those hawks on her side. I'll protect Muslims from wars, which is all bullshit, right? Donald Trump did, this whole crap that, he didn't start any new wars. Loads of Muslims died on Donald Trump's watch. He loosened the restrictions on drone strikes in Somalia and Pakistan. He helped MBS bomb Yemen. Like, he did not have a good foreign policy record. But Americans have short memories, so there was this idea of, oh, I'm anti-war and anti-interventionist. She's a hawk. Vote for me. And some of them did. As I say, the majority still voted for Harris. Many others voted for Jill Stein as a protest for the third-party Green candidate. But some were seduced by Donald Trump's siren call. And now some of them, I'm sure, are getting buyer's remorse when they see the people he's appointing to his administration.
Was your stance on the Middle East linked to your departure from MSNBC?
Is the reason I left MSNBC because of the Middle East? No, I left MSNBC because they cancelled my shows. Why they cancelled my shows, you'd have to ask MSNBC.
Presumably you've asked MSNBC.
I did.
What did they say?
They said it was for business reasons.
Do you think, does that strike you as true?
Strikes me as what they're saying.
Fair enough. I'm not going to push that one. Look, America doesn't have a lot of prominent Muslim voices. How conscious are you of having that role? How much does that sort of figure in your understanding of yourself as a political entity?
It's a good question. It's a question I've dealt with even on your side of the pond back when I was in the UK, and I lived in the UK until 2015, till I was in my mid-30s. And it was a question I often asked myself there as well, at a time when war on terror was raging, lots of debates about Islamic extremism, and people would come to me, Channel 4 News, Sky News, BBC Breakfast, come on and be the Muslim guy. So I've always had that on kind of, whether I like it or not. People say, oh, we shouldn't focus on identity politics. Like, it's part of life. I am am I a journalist who happens to be Muslim? Am I a Muslim journalist? We can play pedantry all day long. Clearly, there aren't many Muslim voices in journalism, in public life, in the UK or the US, especially in the US, although it's changing for the better. We have more Muslims elected to Congress. At MSNBC, I had 2 Muslim colleagues who were hosts, Ayman and Ali. So it is changing for the better. But yes, at times like this, in the middle of moments like this, clearly people like me become a lightning rod, because we are saying stuff that the mainstream either doesn't want to hear or has never heard before and is shocked to hear. And that becomes problematic for a lot of people. And obviously, it does put a little bit of a target on your back when the next president of the United States is a kind of card-carrying Islamophobe, appointing card-carrying Islamophobes to his administration. I've had threats from people on the Trump side. It's not ideal, but someone has to say this stuff. Someone has to give a different perspective. Someone has to speak for minority communities. It's not, as I say, I wasn't elected to do so. I don't see myself as a spokesperson for other people. But as you say, by virtue of being a rare voice in this field, it falls upon me. I wish it wasn't the case. I wish there were loads of people to pick from. But that isn't the case, sadly. I also carry an extra hat here, which I didn't carry in the UK, which is I'm an immigrant here as well. So I'm the trifecta. I'm everyone Donald Trump loves. I'm a journalist, an immigrant, and a Muslim.
You're a Shia Muslim, and the majority of Muslim voices we hear in the West, indeed the majority of the West's Muslim ally countries, are Sunni. Is that a factor for you as well?
I'd like to think not. I'm sure in the eyes of some people. It's interesting. We just had recently the fall of Assad. And when the Syrian civil war, Hugo, was at its height, when people were being killed in 2015-16, the massive fighting going on between Syrian rebels and Assad, I was one of those people. I was in the UK at the time before I moved to the US in 2015. I remember going on Question Time and slamming Assad and slamming rebels, and people having a go at me saying, you're both siding this. I worked at Al Jazeera at the time as well, Hugo. So I had this simultaneous thing of people saying to me, you are a Shia Muslim infiltrator of like Sunni media. And at the same time, it was like, for the Shia community, it was like, you're a sellout to Sunnis because you don't support Assad or whatever it is, or Hezbollah. And I've always had that, right? Different parts of different communities will always want you to kind of toe the line. I've never been a partisan in that sense. I refuse to be a tribalist, even in my politics. I've never been a blind supporter of the Labour Party or the Democratic Party. And I just think, I try and judge issues on their merits, not on the political, ideological, or sectarian merits. I mean, I'll give you an example. I opposed the Iraq invasion. Quite a few of my Iraqi Shia friends supported the Iraq invasion in 2003 because they wanted to see the fall of Saddam. It's a majority Shia country. And similarly, in Syria, I didn't support, the US attempt to kind of get rid of Assad. But that wasn't because of sectarian reasons. I also didn't support, I also was happy to see the back of Assad, right? Recently, when Assad's gone, I was cheering. I would support freedom for the Syrian people, which is now a majority Sunni country.
Are you religious, Mehdi?
How do you define religious?
Do you have faith? Do you believe? I know you once had a debate with Richard Dawkins, and he found your literal belief in Islam boggling. Are your beliefs much as they were then?
Yes, I'm a person of faith. I've always been a person of faith since I was a child. I try and practice my faith to the best of my ability. I try not to let my faith get involved in every political judgment I make. I do kind of try and respect certain boundaries. But yes, I'm a Muslim. I'm a proud Muslim. I believe in God. I pray. I fast. I go on pilgrimage. I do all of the things that Muslims are expected to do. I don't know if that makes me religious or not, but yes, faith is a very important part of my life. It keeps me going at times like this. When I've spoken to audiences, in particular Muslims, but not just Muslims, and people talk about, right now everyone's very demoralized, as you can imagine. In the US, you go, well, 50% of the population is extremely demoralized. The other half are very happy. But the demoralized lot are feeling like hope has gone, right? They're feeling like this is what's going to happen to our democracy. A second term of Donald Trump is going to be an existential threat to American values and institutions. Life is wildfires in LA, climate change. And actually, for me as a person of faith, it's the only way I can keep hope. It's because I'm a person of faith that I keep hope, even though I'm not an optimist. And I try and remind people optimism and hope are two very different things. I'm very pessimistic, but I still remain hope-filled.
Dawkins asked you if you believed that the prophet flew to heaven on a winged horse, and you told him you did. Is that the same sort of belief that you have that you're talking to me right now, or is it a different sort of belief?
So on the winged horse, which is called Buraq, I just want to go, I've never clarified this in 12 years or whatever it was, but I'll clarify it now. I actually believe that is a metaphor in the Quran, right? For a spirit, for some form of spiritual journey. And there's a lot of Islamic scholars who support this. But why I said yes that day was because he was so condescending and belittling. And with Dawkins, he's an Islamophobe, right? I'm against all religions. No, you're not. And he's made that very clear recently. I'm a cultural Christian. I want to save the cathedrals. Just the mosques he has a problem with. What annoyed me about that was he would never have said that to a Christian politician. He would never have said that to Tony Blair. Do you believe in the literal virgin birth of Jesus? All right. And that's what annoyed me, which is why I said yes. Because
I think he might have done.
Well, I've not seen it. Show me the clip of him grilling multiple. He loved Barack Obama. I don't think he ever said question Obama's belief in the virgin birth. My point being is, right, every religion believes in miracles, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a religious person, you believe in miracles, whether you believe in angels or virgin birth or trips to heaven or just a belief in God, right? So that was my resistance. I believe that particular story may be a metaphor, but do I believe in miracles? Yes. Do I believe in angels who I can't see? Yes. I'm a believer. I believe in all those things. Do I believe it in the same way that we're having this conversation? Well, it's interesting because we're having this conversation remotely. I'm seeing you on a screen. I probably do. It's a good question. Do I believe in every aspect of Islamic tradition 110%? Probably not. I have questions about lots of things. But if you're asking me, do I believe in God to the same extent as I'm having this conversation? Yes. In fact, more so. I believe in God more than I believe in anything else.
You recently, you think Elon Musk is promoting racist and Islamophobic tropes across the UK? I mean, yeah, but that's not the issue right now. What do you think motivates him?
That is a great question. People's heads who I can't get inside of are Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and they are the two most important people in America right now, sadly. I don't know what motivates him, right? This is a great question about the Zuckerbergs, Musks, and the tech bros. What is driving them? Is it personal gain and self-aggrandizement? Are they supporting Republicans because they just want lower taxes and less regulation, which is one cynical, simple explanation? I think in Zuckerberg's case, that is probably the case. With Musk, I think he has red-pilled himself in plain sight. I think we've watched him over the last 2, 3, 4 years radicalize online. We've seen his interactions. He's done it not in his mum's basement hidden away. He's done it in the sight of the entire world with 200 million followers. And I think we've seen that over the years. He's become more and more radical. I mean, I was never a fan of Elon Musk. Even when he was just famous for his cars and pretending to be Tony Stark in real life, I always thought he was deeply overrated and annoying. But I didn't think he was a white supremacist or a conspiracy theorist or an enabler of fascists. That is what he's become in recent years. And yeah, you have to ask the question. I don't know. A psychologist would have to analyze him. I don't know if you follow his trans daughter on one of the social media sites. She's always giving all sorts of explanations for why she thinks her father is gone a bit nuts. And she says he was always a bit right-wing and bigoted towards Muslims and others. So she says. I'm sure he would deny it. But the reality is, it doesn't matter what's in his head. This is like this old chestnut that media newsrooms did during the first Trump term. Well, we can't call him a racist. We don't know what's in his heart. I don't give a shit what's in people's hearts or heads. I give a shit what they say and do. That's what I'm going to judge you on. And what he says and does is deeply bigoted, dangerous, conspiratorial, delusional, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and more.
his recent interventions in British politics have been about basically sort of revitalizing stories about grooming gangs, which he
Yes.
refers to alternately as Asian grooming gangs, Muslim grooming gangs, British
Yeah.
Pakistani grooming gangs, and so on. How does that look for you, where you are speaking as a British Muslim? The way that story's been developing in the UK over the last week or so.
It's horrific. And look, this story, even when it first broke, and it was the Times and Andrew Norfolk that broke the story originally in the way that we understand it today. Even that came with all sorts of tropes, right? Like this is one. I was on Piers Morgan's show recently for my sins, and I said the same thing to him. I said, look, I'm not against just talking about this. These are horrific crimes. And if there's a racial angle, we should talk about the racial angle. It's how you do it, right? The problem is, as you know, Hugo, there's enough bad faith actors willing to jump on any bandwagon. And there are people who want to have sensitive, nuanced discussions about this stuff, but they can't because the Elon Musks and, of course, the Tommy Robinsons come barging in the way, pushing their own racist agendas, I would add in the Nigel Farages of this world. And that's a real problem. I think British Muslims already were living in a lot of fear and paranoia post the riot. I came back a few months ago, when is it, September, I think it was, and I was talking to Nish Kumar, who's not Muslim, British Asian comedian, and he was saying, like, I've never felt like this before. After these riots, the Southport riots, as a British Asian, I've never felt as insecure as I feel in my country right now. He's not even Muslim, which was for any brown people. Saida Varsi, in her new book on Islamophobia, her opening chapter, she talks about the fact that all her British Muslim friends have discussed a plan B. What happens if we have to leave this country? And as someone of Jewish descent, that is conversations that Jews have had over the years in different countries. Yeah. And it's not a pleasant conversation for a Muslim minority community to have, whether in the US or in the UK. And this kind of stuff is deeply, deeply weaponized, right? Look, let's talk about grooming and gangs and rape and child sexual. No issues should be off limits. It's how it's done. And why does Musk suddenly kick it off now?
Well,
why bring it up now? Why do it in the way he's done it? Why lie? Many of his tweets have just been frankly dishonest and completely made up. It's really, really dangerous. And look, I just say this one thing more. The Christchurch mosque shooter, the guy who went into the two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, and killed over 50 Muslims in Friday prayers, he had "For Rotherham" written on his ammo, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about having a Rotherham, but it does mean that if you do it in the wrong way, and if you allow the wrong people to weaponize it, people will die.
One way this is being spoken about a lot in right-wing circles in the UK is that what has happened in Rotherham and other places is the product of a view common among some Muslims that people who are not Muslims are not human beings in the same way that they are human beings.
Yeah.
You yourself, some time ago, made comments in a speech you were giving in which you appeared to say things that were kind of along those lines. You said, once we lose the moral high ground, we're no different from the rest of the non-Muslims, human beings who live their lives as animals. Now, you've said you regret saying those remarks, and you've said it often enough that I definitely believe that you do. However, that gives you an insight into this, I would have thought, into the sort of thing people are talking about when they flag up this kind of thing and are alarmed by it. What would you say about that?
So a few things, just to deal with the personal thing first. The remarks that I made, 15, 20 years ago, they were in a religious context. Right? I was giving a kind of religious lecture to Muslims in a religious setting, right? So I don't think it applies in the Rotherham situation. I'll tell you why in a moment. But just to deal with those were remarks about like the theological nature of Muslims versus non-Muslims, the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims, how Muslims approach God. They were horribly phrased. They came out sounding bigoted. And separate remarks, which you haven't mentioned, that I also made, which were about views of kind of gay communities. They were kind of from a very social conservative background upbringing, which, yes, I have rejected a long time ago. And I've spoken about why I've evolved from those views. Now I'm in my mid-40s and take very different views, right? But they were in I don't think, Hugo, with respect, they apply here because they were a religious discussion. And I don't believe anything that happened in Rotherham where it was religious, right? I interviewed Nazir Afzal the other day, who, as you know, was the former Crown Chief Prosecutor for the Northwest of England, of British Pakistani descent, Muslim background, locked up a lot of these gang members, both brown and white. And he made the same point. These people are as far away from Islam as you can possible. Like, you don't have to be an expert on Islamic law to know that alcohol, pretty much off limits. These guys were not just raping girls. They were plying them with alcohol and drugs to rape them. There were multiple sins and crimes involved from both a secular and an Islamic perspective. None of these people were religious people.
You don't think there's a link between religious attitudes and social attitudes?
I think there may be social attitudes. I don't believe they're religious people. I don't believe these people are religious people, right? And so, but on the social attitudes, let me just address that. So in a couple of the local inquiries, I believe in Telford and maybe Rotherham, in some of the independent inquiries we've done, they did say that some of this may have been down to, we need to look into political correctness on the side of the councils, police, but also, what were the attitudes of these people towards non-Muslims. But in others, they haven't said that. And I would just make one important point. In the report done by Professor Alexis Jay, she mentions that there were Asian girls who were also abused. What frustrates me is this is framed, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but in general, the media frames this as brown men raping white girls. Put it to one side that there are lots of white gangs who raped white girls in Cornwall, in the West Midlands, in Glasgow, which we're not talking about because that doesn't fit the Farage-Musk agenda. Put that to one side for a moment. Even if we just stick to talking about these horrible men in the Rotherhams and Telfords, they also abused Asian girls. We don't hear enough about those Asian girls. A, it doesn't fit a political agenda. B, a lot of them didn't come forward because of the whole shame inside the Asian community. And so this idea that this was just like a brown man going, well, those white girls, they're lesser than us. That doesn't, as we know, with all the research on rapists and abuse, they tend to abuse the people closest to them. And that includes Asian girls in their own communities, their own families. So I would like to see, people like, let's have another national inquiry. I'm not in favor of another national inquiry, but I do want to see a lot more of the research and data that is out there already on the attitudes of these men, what they did, which girls were affected. I don't think it's just too lazy and easy to say, well, it was brown men looking down on white girls. It also doesn't explain Cornwall, West Midlands, Glasgow, and beyond. Why were white men grooming white girls? There's no Islamic or race angle there. And as Nazir Afzal points out, if you just make it about brown men, you're ignoring 97% of the child sexual abuse in this country, and you're ignoring the victims of those crimes. I would like to treat the victims equally, regardless of the race, ethnicity, or religion of the perpetrator.
Mehdi Hasan, I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid I've got to vacate the studio. Before I let you go, are you ever coming back to us?
That's a great question. At the moment, not voluntarily, but we'll see what happens in the course of the next 4 years.
Mehdi Hasan, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Hugo.